"Sir, this area is for real customers," the receptionist snapped, her tone dripping with dismissiveness. Caleb, a 75-year-old retired Army radio operator, sat quietly in the corner, still waiting for anyone, to notice him. But no one did. They passed him by, ignoring the man who had sacrificed so much, just because of his age and humble appearance. 40 minutes later, the doors swung open, and a familiar voice boomed across the showroom like a storm, demanding the respect Caleb deserved. If this made your blood boil, comment respect for every hero overlooked. On the edge of a quiet town stood a modest house, where lived Caleb Matthews, a man who had once served with distinction in the military, and whose life had taken a quiet turn after his service. A veteran of the Army Signal Corps, Caleb had spent years in some of the most perilous environments, ensuring clear communications when it mattered most, often between life and death. After retiring, he returned to civilian life, choosing a humble existence. His days were spent fixing radios in his garage and volunteering at the local VFW 3 days a week, helping younger veterans navigate the labyrinth of benefits they had rightfully earned. One chilly autumn morning, his old neighbor Thomas offered to take him to a local dealership. Caleb had saved for years, hoping to buy a reliable car. Nothing fancy, just something that could get him to his medical appointments and the store during the brutal winters that made walking impossible. Dressed in his most presentable, yet worn clothes, Caleb stepped into the dealership, his boots polished from years of use. The showroom gleamed with bright lights, and the smell of new leather filled the air, but Caleb was greeted with nothing but cold indifference. Despite his patience, no one seemed to notice the man sitting quietly near the coffee machine. He waited, the way he had learned to wait during his military days, silent, unnoticed, but ever present. When a receptionist finally approached, her dismissive attitude spoke volumes. "This area is for customers, sir," she said, emphasizing the word customers with a scornful edge. Caleb simply nodded and softly explained, "I'm here to buy a car." But even then, no one seemed to care. The world, it seemed, had moved on from men like Caleb, men who had sacrificed everything in silence. As Caleb waited patiently, a feeling of unease settled in his chest. The constant buzzing of phones, the soft hum of the coffee machine, and the murmurs of salespeople were drowned out by the distant ticking of the clock. Each passing minute seemed to mock him, reminding him of how invisible he had become. His weathered hands rested on his knees, and his eyes wandered around the showroom as if trying to piece together a puzzle, but no one seemed to notice. The silence stretched on until, finally, a sharp voice broke through. Caleb looked up to see a young sales associate walking past, laughing with another colleague about something trivial. It was then that Caleb's fingers brushed against his pocket, pulling out a small, tattered notebook. He began to sketch quietly, drawing the precise diagrams of radio antennae and call signs he had once relied on in the jungles of Vietnam. His mind, like his hands, was steady, and the humdrum of the modern world faded into the background. This notebook was a relic from another time, but it reminded him of when he mattered. Suddenly, the showroom door opened with a jingle, and all eyes turned to the sleek black SUV that rolled into the parking lot. The vehicle was polished, its dark surface gleaming in the morning sun. A figure emerged from the car, his steps commanding attention as he walked into the dealership. Caleb immediately recognized him. It was Colonel Henry Porter, his old commanding officer and a man who had been through the heat of battle with Caleb years ago. As the colonel walked into the showroom, the air seemed to shift. He was different now, dressed in a sharp, tailored suit, but his posture was unmistakable. The military presence that had once kept their squad alive now filled the room, and all conversations abruptly stopped. "Caleb Matthews," Porter called out, his voice booming across the showroom floor. "I've been looking for you." The receptionist blinked, stunned. "You know him?" she stammered, her eyes wide with confusion. "Know him?" Colonel Porter's voice softened as he walked toward Caleb, his arm opening to embrace him. "This man saved my life. Twice." Caleb's eyes met Porter's, the years of silence between them evaporating in that moment. The world outside the dealership had forgotten men like them, but here, in this strange intersection of fate, it seemed the past had come rushing back. The moment Caleb and Colonel Porter embraced, the atmosphere in the showroom shifted. The salespeople, who had previously brushed off Caleb's quiet presence, now stood frozen, staring in disbelief. The receptionist stumbled back, unsure how to handle the sudden change in the room's dynamic. The young sales associate, Elliot, who had been the first to mock Caleb, now stood with his mouth agape. "What's going on here?" he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. Porter, seemingly unaffected by the shocked stares, turned to the manager of the dealership. "Do you know how you've been treating this man?" he asked, his voice sharp, but controlled. The manager stuttered, fumbling with his tie as if he just realized the gravity of the situation. I didn't know," he mumbled. "We didn't know he was a veteran." "You didn't ask," Colonel Porter responded, his tone cold and unwavering. "And that's the problem. You've made assumptions based on his appearance, assuming his worth. You've ignored the man behind the clothes, and in doing so, you've forgotten the very thing that makes you human: respect." The showroom remained silent. The once apathetic employees were now visibly uncomfortable, their shame palpable. The room seemed smaller, as if the walls were closing in on them, and Caleb sat quietly, his weathered eyes betraying no emotion. He had lived through much worse in his lifetime, but the sting of being overlooked by those who should have known better was sharp nonetheless. As Porter spoke, his words seemed to echo in the quiet, filling the space like an unspoken reprimand. He made a call on his phone, the conversation quick and sharp. Caleb looked on, uncertain of what would happen next. The minutes stretched on until Porter hung up and looked at the gathered group. "You've misjudged this man," he said softly, "and now you'll have to live with the consequences." He turned toward Caleb, his expression softening. "But not today. Today, my friend, we fix this." Porter turned to the sales manager, his eyes narrowing. "I'm buying this dealership," he announced, his words landing like a bombshell. "Effective immediately, I'm the new owner." The silence was deafening. The staff stood frozen, blinking as if trying to process the sudden shift in power. The manager, now pale, took a step back, his hands trembling. "I've purchased a majority stake in this dealership. I'm the boss now." Porter's smile was thin, but it was full of satisfaction. "And I'm going to make sure it's run the right way. Starting with Caleb." The shock in the room was palpable as the employees exchanged glances, unsure of what to make of the turn of events. The sales manager stood frozen, his coffee mug slipping from his hands and shattering on the floor, the sound echoing through the showroom like a symbol of the shattering of old prejudices. "Caleb, pick a car," Colonel Porter said, his voice firm but with a hint of kindness. "No paperwork, no payments. Whatever you need. It's the least we can do." The dealership had been forever changed in that moment, not just by the power of money, but by the realization that respect and dignity should never be bought, they should be given freely. As Caleb and Colonel Porter stood in the showroom, the weight of the situation began to sink in. The realization of what had just occurred was profound. What had started as a routine visit to buy a car had become a turning point in both Caleb's life and the culture of the dealership. The salespeople, once so dismissive, now stood in a line, awaiting direction. The manager, whose face was pale and devoid of color, began to stammer and apologize, but Caleb simply nodded, not yet ready to address the chaos that had just unfolded. The whole room had changed. It wasn't just the ownership of the dealership that had shifted, it was the mindset of those inside it. Caleb had been underestimated, his worth written off simply because of his appearance. But now, in the face of Colonel Porter's powerful words and actions, the staff saw what they had failed to recognize earlier. Caleb wasn't just a man with a modest past, he was a hero. A man who had sacrificed for others without hesitation, whose quiet humility had masked a lifetime of valor and wisdom. As Caleb looked around, he could feel the shift in the air. The receptionist, who had initially scowled at him, now lowered her eyes in a silent apology, her posture less rigid and more open. The salesman, who had mocked him earlier, no longer seemed confident in their superiority. In fact, their faces were now filled with a mixture of shame and curiosity. The entire atmosphere in the dealership was one of introspection, as if every person in the room had been forced to confront their own biases. But Colonel Porter wasn't finished. With a stern glance at the sales team, he spoke again, his voice cutting through the tension. "Everyone here," he said, "needs to be retrained. Not just on the cars we sell, but on how we treat people. Every person who walks through that door deserves respect. You will show it, or you will leave." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of years of leadership. Caleb watched as the staff shifted, each one beginning to understand what they had failed to grasp before. This wasn't just about selling cars, it was about understanding people. It was about recognizing the worth of every individual, regardless of how they appeared or where they came from. For Caleb, the moment was bittersweet. He had never sought recognition. He hadn't wanted praise or accolades. He had only wanted to buy a car. But now, here he was, witnessing a transformation, not just in the dealership, but in the very attitudes of the people who worked there. He had come in as an overlooked, invisible man, and he was leaving with the understanding that, perhaps for the first time in a long while, he had been seen, truly seen, for who he was. The ripple effect of Colonel Porter's intervention was swift and far-reaching. Caleb, still processing the events that had unfolded, was given a new sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in years. When Porter turned to him and said, "Pick your car," Caleb hesitated. This wasn't just about the car anymore. It was about something deeper. His mind wandered back to the time when he had been in the service, always on alert, always prepared to move quickly, to act decisively. But this time, the decision wasn't one that had to be made on instinct. This was different. It was personal. As Caleb stepped forward, the weight of the decision settled on his shoulders. The dealership, once just a place to buy a car, had become a symbol, a place where things could be made right. The choice in front of him wasn't about what kind of car he wanted, it was about the significance of that car. This wasn't just any vehicle, it was a representation of everything he had been through and everything he had endured, both in battle and in life. It was about respect. It was about being seen. Meanwhile, the sales staff, now visibly unsettled, watched Caleb with a newfound respect. Greg, the young salesman who had questioned his colleagues earlier, stepped forward with a quiet confidence. He had heard the change in Colonel Porter's words and recognized that this was not just a moment for Caleb, but for all of them. He approached Caleb cautiously and asked, "If it's all right with you, Mr. Matthews, I'd be honored to help you find exactly what you need." Caleb looked at Greg and smiled, a small, but genuine smile. "Let's do it together, son." His voice was steady, as though the years of waiting, the years of feeling invisible, had finally given way to something different. Something good. As Caleb and Greg walked through the dealership, a shift occurred not only within Caleb, but within the entire dealership. The staff, who had once treated him as an invisible customer, began to notice something different in the way they looked at the world around them. They had been given a new perspective, a chance to learn, to change, and to grow. In the back office, Colonel Porter continued to observe the unfolding events, his face a portrait of satisfaction. He had always believed in the value of service, not just in the military sense, but in every interaction. "This is how it's done," he whispered to himself, as the realization settled in that this was just the beginning. The days following Caleb's encounter at the dealership were transformative, not just for him, but for everyone involved. As he walked through the lot with Greg, he couldn't help but feel the significance of the moment. He had come into that showroom as an overlooked, aging man, dismissed because of his modest appearance. But now, he walked with purpose. Every step he took was a reminder of the battles he had fought, the sacrifices he had made, and the courage he had carried through his life, even when the world around him had forgotten. The car he chose was simple, not flashy, but it had everything he needed: reliable, sturdy, and ready for the winters that would come. As Caleb sat in the driver's seat for the first time, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted inside him. This wasn't just about getting from point A to point B, this was about reclaiming his sense of worth. He had always valued humility, but today, he had been reminded that humility didn't mean being invisible. It didn't mean letting the world walk over you. It meant holding your ground, standing firm in your convictions, and recognizing when it was time for others to see you for who you truly were. Meanwhile, the sales staff had started to change, too. Greg, who had been the first to question the treatment of Caleb, began to approach his job with a renewed sense of respect. He made sure that every customer who walked into the dealership, regardless of their appearance or background, was treated with dignity. He had learned, through Caleb's quiet presence and Colonel Porter's intervention, that there was more to life than just making a sale. There was an unspoken value in treating people well, in making them feel seen. Colonel Porter's influence was evident in the dealership's shift in culture. It wasn't just about the new ownership or the new rules, it was about the understanding that every person, regardless of their age, appearance, or background, deserved to be treated with respect. Porter made sure that every employee was retrained, not just in the mechanics of selling cars, but in the art of truly listening to the people they served. The walls of the dealership, once cold and impersonal, were now adorned with signs reminding the staff that every person who walked through that door had a story. Every person had a reason for being there. As the days passed, Caleb continued to visit the dealership, but now it was different. He wasn't just another customer. He had become a symbol of what could happen when people stopped judging others based on their appearances. His presence in the dealership was a quiet testament to the power of respect and dignity. One afternoon, Caleb arrived to see the receptionist, who had once dismissed him, standing by the front desk. This time, her expression was different, one of understanding. She nodded at him, a silent acknowledgement of the lesson she had learned. Caleb nodded back, his eyes softening with gratitude. He didn't need words. He knew the message had been received. The story of Caleb Matthews and Colonel Porter spread like wildfire. What had begun as a simple, unnoticed trip to buy a car had turned into a defining moment not just for the dealership, but for the entire community. News outlets began to pick up the story, and social media exploded with posts from veterans and military families who recognized the significance of the events that had unfolded. Veteran treated with dignity at local dealership, one headline read. Former Army hero buys dealership, changes culture, another declared. As the story spread, people from all walks of life began to reach out to Caleb, expressing their gratitude for his service and for the lessons he had taught. They saw not just a man who had served in Vietnam, but a man who had quietly carried the weight of his experiences, a man whose strength lay in his ability to endure, to stay true to his values, and to remain humble in the face of an ever-changing world. By now, Caleb had become a regular at the dealership, but he wasn't just there to buy a car anymore. He had become a part of the community, part of a family. As the sun began to set on one particular evening, Caleb and Colonel Porter stood outside, watching workers install a new sign above the dealership entrance, Matthews and Porter Motors, built on honor. Caleb turned to Porter, his voice quiet but full of emotion. I never thought I'd be in business, he said, the weight of his words settling in the air between them. Porter chuckled softly, shaking his head. Neither did I, Caleb. Neither did I. But some partnerships, they both knew, were forged for life, rooted in respect, in honor, and in the unspoken bond between two men who had shared more than their fair share of struggles. As Caleb drove his new truck, his American flag decal proudly displayed on the back window, into the dealership parking lot the next morning, he felt a sense of pride he had never known before. This time, when he walked through the door, every employee stood up. They greeted him not just as a customer, but as a man who had earned their respect. Greg, the young salesman, approached with a steaming cup of coffee, his smile warm and genuine. I asked around about how you like your coffee, he said, handing the cup to Caleb, who chuckled as he took it. "Someone's been paying attention," Caleb remarked, his eyes crinkling at the corners. But it wasn't just the coffee. It was the change in the air. The respect that had once been absent was now present, not just in the employees' actions, but in their hearts. The receptionist, now working in customer relations, gave Caleb a nod as he passed by her desk, a silent acknowledgement of the transformation that had taken place within her, within the dealership, and within herself. At the end of the day, as Caleb prepared to leave, a young man in a faded military jacket approached him. "I saw the story online," the man said, his voice full of gratitude. "Thank you for everything you did back then, and for what you've done for all of us now." Caleb placed a hand on the young veteran's shoulder, his voice soft but resolute. "No voice unheard," he said, a phrase that had become his mantra over the years. The phrase was later displayed on the wall behind the reception desk, in bold bronze letters that caught the morning light. It became the dealership's new motto, a constant reminder to everyone who entered that no one's story should ever be ignored. The dealership, once known for its coldness and indifference, had become a place where veterans and customers alike were treated with the respect they deserved. And so, Caleb's story lived on, not just in the cars he sold, but in the hearts of all who passed through the doors of Matthews and Porter Motors. It was a reminder that some heroes never stop serving, and that true respect begins with listening. This story underscores the lesson that everyone has a story, whether it's a veteran, a humble worker, or anyone who walks through life with quiet courage. Caleb didn't ask for accolades, and he didn't demand special treatment. He simply wanted to be seen, and in the end, that's what he received. The shift in perspective, both at the dealership and in the lives of those involved, reflects the idea that value isn't based on appearance or superficial assumptions. It's based on the respect you show others, and the genuine understanding that every person is deserving of that respect. If you believe that respect begins with listening and that every person has a story worth hearing, subscribe to TrueKind Stories for more inspiring stories that remind us all of the power of compassion and understanding. Leave a comment below and tell us about a time when you were able to see someone beyond their appearance. How did it change your perspective?